March 3rd, 2019. Elena Vasquez had been clean for 15 years. No cartel money, no midnight surgeries, no more scars carved into her flesh with ceremonial blades. That's exactly why the man bleeding out on her clinic floor terrified her more than any Sicario ever had. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb didn't stumble into her El Paso clinic by accident. He'd driven 60 miles with a bullet in his shoulder, passing 12 hospitals, to find her specifically. The moment he rolled up his sleeve and saw the geometric scars covering her forearms, everything changed. "I know what those mean," he whispered. Elena's hands froze over his wound. Those scars were a death sentence, the cartel's signature, their brand. No one outside the organization had ever seen them and lived to describe them. Webb wasn't there for medical treatment. He was there because somewhere in a classified file, someone had documented those exact markings, someone who knew the cartel's most protected secrets, someone who'd been watching her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The clock on the clinic wall ticked past midnight. Elena's hands remained suspended above Webb's shoulder, the gauze in her fingers trembling like a white flag of surrender. In the harsh, fluorescent light, she could see his pupils weren't dilated from blood loss. They were sharp, calculating, studying her reaction. "You need to leave," she whispered, stepping back from the examination table. "Now!" Webb's laugh came out as a wheeze. "Can't exactly drive myself anywhere, Doc. Not with your handiwork leaking all over your floor." Elena glanced at the blood pooling beneath the table. Arterial spray painted the wall behind him in a pattern she'd seen too many times before. He was right. He'd bleed out before he reached the parking lot. But keeping him here meant exposure, discovery, the end of everything she'd built. There are hospitals. "I told you. I came here for a reason." Webb's voice hardened. March 15th, 2004. Mass grave outside Juarez, 43 bodies. Every single one had identical scars carved post-mortem. Geometric patterns, same as yours. Elena's blood turned to ice water. She remembered that date. The cartel's message to a rival faction. Dr. Morales had been forced to mutilate the corpses while Elena watched, learning what happened to those who disappointed their handlers. The scars on her arms bore the same pattern, a reminder of her own mortality. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The hell you don't." Webb tried to sit up, winced, fell back. Those markings were classified, never released to media. Only 3 people in the US government ever saw those crime scene photos. Elena's hands moved automatically, muscle memory overriding fear. She pressed gauze against his wound, applied pressure. 15 years of legitimate practice couldn't erase 20 years of survival instincts. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because one of those 3 people is dirty. And you're the only person alive who can prove it." The gauze turned crimson under her palms. Webb's pulse was strong but rapid. The bullet had missed the subclavian artery by millimeters. Lucky. Or maybe he'd positioned himself deliberately. Soldiers learned to take wounds that looked worse than they were. "I don't know any Americans. I never—" Operation Desert Rose. Webb's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. February 2014. Your people knew we were coming. Set up an ambush that killed 8 of my brothers. Someone fed them our intel. Someone who'd seen those crime scene photos. Elena's pressure on the wound faltered. February 2014. She remembered the celebration at the compound, the cartel leadership drinking expensive tequila, toasting their victory over the American Special Forces team. They'd known everything, troop movements, extraction points, even the soldiers' names. I was just a doctor. They didn't tell me their sources. But you were there. You saw who came and went. You treated their wounded after our raids. Webb's eyes bored into hers. You know who visited the compound, who had access. The clinic's back door rattled in its frame. Elena's head snapped toward the sound, her hands instinctively reaching for the scalpel on the instrument tray. In the old days, unexpected visitors meant someone was about to die. Usually her, if she'd disappointed them. Wind. Just wind. but her heart hammered against her ribs. "I can't help you," she said, "even if I wanted to. They'll kill me. They'll kill everyone I've ever spoken to. That's how this works. They think you're dead." Elena stared at him. "What?" "Car accident. March 15th, 2004. Same day as the mass grave discovery. Elena Vasquez, 39, killed in a single vehicle collision outside El Paso. Dental records confirmed it. Case closed. Her hands stopped moving entirely. She'd known about the staged accident, the cartel's way of erasing her existence when they released her. But she'd never imagined it extended to official records. "Someone buried your old identity real deep," Webb continued. "New social security number, new birth certificate, new everything. Whoever helped you disappear had serious government connections. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her escape hadn't been luck or careful planning. Someone had orchestrated it. Someone with the power to create new identities, to manipulate federal databases. The same person who's running for Senate next month," Webb said. "The same person who sold out my team." Richard Castellanos. Elena knew that name. Everyone in Texas knew it. The former DEA hero turned politician, campaigning on his record of fighting cartels and securing the border. His face stared down from billboards across El Paso, promising law and order. "He saved your life 15 years ago," Webb said. "Now I need you to help me destroy his." Outside, a car engine turned over in the parking lot. Elena moved to the window, peered through the blinds. Empty street, shadows that could hide anything. She turned back to Webb, meeting his eyes for the first time. "If I help you, we're both dead. If you don't help me, a traitor becomes a United States senator, and those 8 soldiers died for nothing." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Elena's fingers traced the edge of the gauze, feeling Webb's blood seep warm through the fabric. His pulse hammered against her palm, steady, determined, alive. So different from the last time she'd felt a heartbeat fade under her hands in that concrete room in Juarez. "You think this is simple," she said finally. "Justice, revenge, black and white. 8 good men are dead. That's pretty black and white to me." Elena moved to the supply cabinet, her movements deliberate and practiced. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and hope, 2 things that had been foreign concepts during her years across the border. She'd built this sanctuary 1 patient at a time, 1 life saved without threats or violence hanging over her head. "Those men you lost," she said, preparing a proper suture kit. "They had families, every one of them." "Children?" Webb's jaw tightened. "Some." Elena threaded the needle with hands that no longer trembled. 15 years of legitimate medicine had steadied them, though the scars on her forearms remained raised and angry, geometric reminders carved with surgical precision. Each mark represented a life she'd saved for monsters who collected ears as trophies and buried their enemies alive. "I had a daughter once," she said. The words came out rougher than she'd intended. Before Juarez, before everything. She could feel Webb watching her as she approached the table. His tactical vest lay in a bloody pile on the floor, revealing a frame built for violence but currently vulnerable, dependent on her mercy. Just like she'd once been dependent on theirs. "Sophia," Elena continued, beginning to clean the wound properly. "She was 7 when they took me. Had my eyes but her father's stubborn streak. Used to insist on reading me bedtime stories instead of the other way around." The antiseptic hissed against torn flesh. Webb didn't flinch. "Where is she now?" "Dead." Elena's voice carried no emotion. A skill learned in captivity. Car accident. Real one, not staged. 3 months after they let me go. She was 22, driving home from her nursing job at Methodist Hospital. Fell asleep at the wheel. She paused in her work, needle suspended mid-stitch. The clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that reminded her too much of other rooms, other procedures performed under duress. I came home to bury my child and discovered I didn't officially exist anymore. Elena Vasquez was dead, remembered by no one. Sophia died believing her mother had abandoned her. Webb's expression shifted, calculation giving way to something that might have been understanding. I'm sorry. Are you? Elena resumed suturing, each stitch precise and careful. Or are you just saying what you think will make me cooperate? Both, probably. His honesty surprised her. In the cartel, truth was a luxury no one could afford. The night they carved these, Elena gestured toward her scars with the needle. I kept thinking about Sophia's bedtime stories. Fairy tales where good always triumphed, where princesses were rescued and dragons were slayed. She believed in heroes. The clinic's back door rattled again. This time Elena didn't startle. She was beginning to recognize the building's rhythm, the way desert wind caught the loose frame, small comforts that had taken years to trust. Castellanos, she said. When I knew him, he went by Ricardo. Spoke perfect Spanish, understood the culture. The cartel leaders respected him because he delivered. Delivered what? Information, operation schedules, asset locations. Elena tied off the suture and began applying fresh gauze. He saved me because I'd seen too much, knew too much, a loose end that needed managing, not eliminating. She stepped back, examining her work. Webb would live, though his shoulder would ache for months. Battle scars had their own language. She'd learned to read them during her years treating sicarios fresh from territorial wars. He gave me a choice, she continued. Disappear forever and stay quiet, or join the mass graves. Not much of a choice, really. Webb struggled to sit up, testing his range of motion. He's going to win, you know, the election. Polling shows him 20 points ahead. Elena walked to the small refrigerator in the corner, removed 2 bottles of water. The mundane action felt surreal after the conversation they'd just had. She'd grown to love these ordinary moments, simple decisions that carried no life or death consequences. Senator Castellanos, she mused, handing him a bottle. Position to do real damage, Defense Committee oversight, border security policy, access to operational intelligence that could get more soldiers killed. Now you're getting it. Elena returned to the window, peering through the blinds at the empty street beyond. Dawn was still hours away, but she could smell rain coming, petrichor mixing with the clinic's antiseptic atmosphere. Soon she'd need to make a decision that would either preserve the quiet life she'd built or destroy it completely. If I help you, she said, not turning from the window, I want something in return. What? I want to visit my daughter's grave as myself. As Elena Vasquez. Just once. In the reflection on the glass, she watched Webb consider this. 8 dead soldiers weighed against one grieving mother's need for closure. Deal, he said finally. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 15 years settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain drummed against the clinic windows with increasing intensity, each drop marking time like a countdown to a decision Elena wasn't ready to make. She watched the water streak down the glass, distorting the streetlights beyond into amber smears that reminded her of the oil lamps they'd used in the compound during power outages. Webb's breathing had steadied behind her, but she could feel his attention like a weight between her shoulder blades. The deal hung in the air between them, her testimony for one moment of peace at her daughter's grave. Such a small request, such an enormous risk. There's something else, Webb said quietly. Elena's reflection in the window went rigid. There was always something else. In her experience, men like Webb, men who dealt in classified intelligence and blood, never revealed their full hand at once. What? The reason I found you wasn't just the scars. Castellanos has been monitoring this clinic for months. The words hit her like ice water. Elena spun from the window, her hand instinctively reaching for the scalpel on the instrument tray. That's impossible. I'm careful. I don't treat anyone who... Not the patients. Webb struggled to sit up straighter, favoring his wounded shoulder. The prescriptions. You've been ordering surgical supplies, specific ones. Same combination you used in Juarez. Elena's mouth went dry. The antibiotics for Miguel Herrera's gunshot wound last month. The specialized sutures for Maria Santos after her husband's accident. She'd told herself these were different, Legitimate patients, not cartel enforcers. But the medical signature remained the same. He's been tracking the pharmaceutical orders through DEA databases, Webb continued, cross-referencing them with known cartel medical profiles. Your pattern stood out like a beacon. The clinic walls seemed to close in around her. 15 years of careful anonymity, and she'd been undone by muscle memory, by the very skills that had kept her alive. How long? She whispered. 6 months. Maybe longer. Elena sank into her desk chair, legs suddenly unsteady. 6 months of being watched. 6 months of false security, while Castellanos gathered intelligence on his loose end. The rain outside intensified, turning from gentle drops into a proper downpour. If he knows where I am, why hasn't he? She stopped, understanding flooding through her like nausea. The election. Webb nodded grimly. Can't risk eliminating you before he's safely in office. Too many variables. But after November 8th, when he's Senator-elect Castellanos, he didn't need to finish. A sound made them both freeze, the distinct rumble of a vehicle turning into the clinic's parking lot. Elena's blood turned to slush as headlight beams swept across the blinds, casting moving shadows on the wall like prison bars. She crept to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. A black SUV sat idling in the lot, its engine running, windshield wipers fighting the rain. Dark windows, government plates, Webb. She breathed. He was already moving, sliding off the examination table with surprising agility for someone who'd been shot an hour ago. His good hand went to his sidearm, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. How many? I can't tell. Windows are tinted. Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. The SUV's headlights stayed on, pointed directly at the clinic's front entrance. Waiting. Her cell phone buzzed on the desk. The sound cut through the rain's white noise like a blade. Elena stared at the device, recognizing the number even though she'd tried to forget it for 15 years. Don't answer it, Webb warned. But Elena was already reaching for the phone. Some conversations couldn't be avoided forever. Elena. The voice on the other end was exactly as she remembered. Smooth, confident, tinged with the slightest accent that most people mistook for southern charm, rather than years spent in Mexican border towns. Ricardo. It's Richard now. Has been for some time. Castellanos chuckled, the sound warm and familiar and terrifying. You've built quite a life for yourself. Small practice, quiet neighborhood, very domestic. Through the blinds, Elena could see a figure moving inside the SUV. A cigarette lighter flared briefly, illuminating sharp cheekbones and cold eyes. What do you want? A conversation. About old times. About mutual friends who seemed to have survived injuries that should have been fatal. His voice hardened slightly. You always were too good at your job, Elena. Webb had moved to the clinic's back exit, testing the door handle. Locked. He began working the deadbolt with silent precision. I saved your life once, Castellanos continued. Gave you everything you needed to disappear. A daughter's grave to visit. A new identity, a clean slate. All I asked in return was silence. Elena's free hand found the scars on her arm, tracing the geometric patterns through her sleeve. I've been silent. Have you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, a second vehicle was pulling into the lot, another SUV, boxing in the clinic's front exit. Elena's sanctuary had become a trap. 15 years of hiding is over, Elena, Castellanos said softly. Time to come home. The line went dead. Elena's phone clattered to the floor, the plastic case cracking against the tile. The sound echoed in the clinic like a gunshot, final and irreversible. Through the blinds, she watched the second SUV's doors open, dark figures emerging into the rain like shadows given form. Back exit, Webb hissed, shouldering his tactical vest despite the fresh sutures pulling at his wound. But Elena didn't move. She stood frozen by the window, watching men she'd hoped never to see again position themselves around her clinic with military precision. They moved like hunters who'd finally cornered wounded prey, taking their time because the outcome was inevitable. Elena Webb's voice cut through her paralysis. "We need to go, now." "There's nowhere to go." Her voice sounded hollow, detached. "You don't understand. When Castellanos makes a move, he's already thought 10 steps ahead." As if summoned by his name, her phone rang again from where it lay broken on the floor. The tinny sound was barely audible over the rain, but it might as well have been thunder. Elena knelt and picked up the device, noting how her hands had begun to shake again, muscle memory from another life. Elena Castellanos didn't wait for her greeting. "Send your friend out the back. My men won't pursue. This conversation is just between us." Webb was shaking his head violently, mouthing, "Don't trust him." But Elena had learned to read the subtle gradations in Castellanos' voice during those months in captivity. The slight softening of consonants that meant he was being honest. The barely perceptible warmth that indicated genuine sentiment rather than manipulation. He would let Webb go. For now. "Why?" she asked. "Professional courtesy. Soldier to soldier. He's just doing his job." A pause filled with the sound of rain on metal. "You and I, we have history. Personal business to resolve." Through the blinds, Elena watched one of the men gesture toward the back of the building. Radio chatter crackled in the storm-heavy air. They knew exactly where Webb was positioned, probably had thermal imaging tracking his movements through the walls. "Go," she told Webb quietly. "Like hell." "I said go." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him step back. For just a moment, the frightened clinic owner disappeared, replaced by someone who'd survived years in cartel captivity through sheer force of will. "This is my choice, my consequence to face." Webb stared at her for a long moment, recognition flickering in his eyes. He was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a victim or potential asset, but as someone who'd learned to navigate monsters and lived to tell about it. The testimony will die with me if that's how this ends. Elena's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already accepted her fate. But maybe it won't. Maybe Ricardo still has a use for me. The back door lock clicked open under Webb's fingers. Rain and wind rushed into the clinic, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and approaching winter. He hesitated in the doorway, looking back. "Your daughter's grave," he said. "I'll make sure you get there, whatever it takes." Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm and darkness beyond. Elena was alone again with the rain and her ghosts. She walked to the front door on unsteady legs, each step carrying her back through 15 years of carefully constructed distance. Her reflection in the glass panels showed a middle-aged woman in scrubs, but underneath she could feel the young doctor who'd been dragged from her home one night, who'd learned to save lives under threat of losing her own. The locks turned easily under her fingers. Muscle memory guided her hands as she disabled the security system, erased the last barriers between herself and the men waiting in the rain. When she opened the door, the storm rushed in like a living thing, soaking her clothes and plastering her graying hair to her skull. Castellanos stood beneath an umbrella 20 feet away, looking exactly as he had when she'd last seen him in that concrete room in Juarez. Time had been kind to him, silver threading through dark hair in distinguished patterns, expensive suit unmarked by the years of violence that had carved themselves into her bones. "Hello, Elena." Behind him, she counted 6 men positioned around the parking lot. Professional, armed, patient as predators who knew their prey had no escape routes left. Richard. The name felt foreign on her tongue. This wasn't the Ricardo who'd spoken Spanish with cartel leaders and understood the brutal economics of fear. This was Senator-elect Castellanos, American politician and border security expert. The transformation was complete. "Walk with me," he said, extending a hand toward the second SUV. "We have so much to discuss." Elena looked back at her clinic one last time, at 15 years of legitimate healing, of quiet redemption earned one patient at a time. Rain streaked down the windows like tears, washing away any trace of the sanctuary she'd built from nothing. She stepped into the storm. The SUV's interior smelled of leather and gun oil, a scent that transported Elena back through 15 years in an instant. She'd forgotten how Castellanos preferred his vehicles, immaculate, climate-controlled, insulated from the chaos he orchestrated outside. The rain drummed against bulletproof glass as they pulled away from her clinic, each drop marking the death of another small comfort she'd never see again. "You look well," Castellanos said, settling beside her in the back seat. "Older, of course, but peaceful. I'd wondered if you'd found that." Elena kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching El Paso's familiar streets blur past. "What do you want, Richard?" "The same thing I've always wanted. Stability, order." He adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit she remembered from their first meeting when he'd still been pretending to be just another DEA liaison. "Your soldier friend has upset a delicate balance." They were heading east toward the industrial district, where abandoned warehouses provided privacy for conversations that couldn't happen in public. Elena's stomach clenched as memories surfaced unbidden. Concrete floors stained with blood, fluorescent lights that never went dark, the constant sound of generators humming like mechanical prayers. "Webb came to me," she said quietly. "I didn't seek him out. But you treated him. Saved his life." Castellanos pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like intelligence reports. Just like old times. Still can't resist playing hero. The accusation hit harder than she'd expected. Elena finally turned to face him, studying the man who'd reshaped her entire existence with a single decision 15 years ago. The boyish features had weathered into something more distinguished, more senatorial. Only his eyes remained unchanged, flat and calculating as a snake's. "I'm a doctor," she said. "It's what I do." "No, Elena. What you do is survive. Everything else is luxury." He slipped the phone back into his jacket. "Do you know what Webb didn't tell you? About that Delta Force unit?" Elena's pulse quickened. There was always more. Layers beneath layers, secrets wrapped in lies, wrapped in half-truths. It was how men like Castellanos maintained control. "They weren't just gathering intelligence on cartel operations," he continued. "They were there to eliminate witnesses, loose ends from an operation that had grown too messy, too exposed. Your name was on their list." The words hit like ice water in her veins. Elena gripped the door handle, suddenly dizzy. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Castellanos' voice carried the patience of a professor explaining simple mathematics. "You think the U.S. government forgot about Elena Vasquez? The surgeon who knew every detail of cartel medical operations, who could identify American assets by voice alone? You were always going to be a problem." Through the rain-streaked window, Elena watched the warehouse district approaching. Familiar territory, hunting grounds where problems got solved permanently. "Webb saved you," Castellanos said softly, "by getting himself shot before the operation could proceed. His unit died because they tried to extract him instead of completing their mission. Quite heroic, really." Elena's mind reeled, trying to process the implications. Webb hadn't come to recruit her testimony. He'd come to kill her. The Wounded Soldier Act, the deal about visiting Sophia's grave, even his apparent sympathy for her loss. All theater. But the medical training kicked in, analyzing details with clinical detachment. The wound pattern was wrong for self-inflicted injury. Too deep, too ragged. Webb's pain responses had been genuine, not performed. "You're lying," she said. "Am I?" Castellanos smiled, the expression warm and terrible. "Or am I simply helping you understand how complicated truth can be?" The SUV pulled into a warehouse complex Elena recognized with sick familiarity. Building 7, where she'd once operated on a cartel enforcer while his victims screamed in the next room. Where she'd learned that mercy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. "Webb is alive because I allowed it," Castellanos continued as they rolled to a stop. "Just like you're alive because I allowed it. I've been protecting you for 15 years, Elena, from enemies you never knew existed." Men emerged from the shadows between buildings, taking positions around the vehicle. Professional, patient. The same breed of predator she'd learned to navigate in Juarez, now wearing American tactical gear instead of cartel colors. But protection has a price, Castellanos said. Always has. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of accumulated years pressing down like burial dirt. 15 years of quiet healing, of building something good from the wreckage of her old life. All of it balanced on the edge of a blade she'd never seen coming. "What do you need me to do?" When she opened her eyes, Castellanos was smiling with what might have been genuine affection. The expression transformed him back into Ricardo, the charming liaison who'd once convinced her that cooperation was survival. "The same thing you've always done," he said softly. "Save a life." The warehouse doors began to open, revealing darkness beyond. The warehouse interior hadn't changed. Harsh fluorescent lights cast everything in the same surgical white that had haunted Elena's dreams for 15 years. The same concrete floors, still bearing dark stains that industrial bleach could never quite erase. Even the smell was identical. Disinfectant and fear, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. But it was the examination table in the center of the space that made Elena's breath catch. Medical grade, properly positioned under the lights. Fresh 4 bags hanging from steel poles like transparent fruit. Someone had prepared for her arrival with careful precision. On the table lay a man Elena didn't recognize. Mid-40s, graying beard, wearing civilian clothes soaked in blood from what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. His breathing was shallow, labored, critical but stable. For now. "Cartel?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "DEA," Castellanos replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone revealing a particularly elegant chess move. "Special Agent Marcus Vega, one of my oldest friends." Elena's hands had already begun their automatic assessment, checking pulse, evaluating wound patterns, calculating blood loss. 15 years of legitimate practice hadn't erased the muscle memory of trauma surgery. But her mind was racing ahead, trying to understand the game being played around this dying man. "He was at the warehouse 5 years ago," Castellanos continued, pulling up a chair to watch her work. "When your Soldier Boy's unit walked into my trap. Marcus provided the intelligence that made it possible." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, but her hands never stopped moving. She was cutting away the agent's shirt, exposing the full extent of the damage. 3 entry wounds, 1 through and through. The others would require surgery within the hour, or he'd bleed out internally. "You want me to save the man who helped murder Webb's unit," she said, understanding flooding through her like nausea. "I want you to save my friend." Castellanos' voice hardened slightly. "The man who's been feeding me DEA intelligence for 8 years, who helped me identify threats to my operation long before they became dangerous." Elena's hands paused over Agent Vega's chest as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Not just one corrupt operation. Years of systematic intelligence gathering. American agents, Mexican sources, cooperative assets like herself, all catalogued and managed by a network that spanned both sides of the border. "How long?" she whispered. "Since the beginning." Castellanos stood, moving to the medical supply cabinet that had been stocked with everything she might need. "Did you really think one DEA liaison could orchestrate your extraction from Juarez alone? Could create a new identity, forge death certificates, establish a funding trail that would satisfy federal scrutiny?" The scars on Elena's arms began to ache, as if responding to proximity to their creator. But now she was seeing them differently, not just as marks of ownership, but as, what, brands of membership in something larger than she'd understood? "I've been building this network for over a decade," Castellanos continued, his voice taking on the prideful tone of a man describing his life's work. "Americans who understand that the border isn't a line, it's a business opportunity. Mexicans who recognize that stability requires cooperation with the right partners. People like you, who learn to survive by making themselves useful." Elena forced herself to focus on the patient. Whatever revelations were reshaping her understanding of the past 15 years, Agent Vega was dying in front of her. She began establishing IV access, her movements automatic despite the emotional chaos in her head. "The clinic," she said as she worked. "The pharmaceutical monitoring. You weren't tracking me as a threat. I was watching over an investment. Castellanos moved closer, and Elena caught his scent, expensive cologne over the deeper musk of violence. Your skills, your knowledge, your ability to work under pressure. Did you think I'd let all that training go to waste? The words reframed everything. 15 years of freedom that had never been freedom at all. A sanctuary that was actually a reservation. Patient selection that had followed patterns designed to keep her skills sharp for exactly this moment. Elena's hands trembled as she inserted the IV line, but not from fear. From rage, pure crystalline fury at her own blindness. "Webb didn't come to kill me," she said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "He came to recruit me. Because someone leaked intelligence about a cartel surgeon who could identify American voices. Someone who wanted him to find me." Castellanos smiled. The warm paternal expression that had once convinced her cooperation meant survival. "He found you exactly when and where I needed him to," he said softly. "Just like you're here, exactly when Marcus needs you." Elena looked down at the dying DEA agent, understanding the final layer of manipulation. She could save this man's life and become complicit in a network of corruption that had killed American soldiers. Or she could let him die and face whatever consequences Castellanos had prepared for that choice. But as her fingers found Agent Vega's pulse, feeling the irregular flutter of a failing heart, Elena realized there was a third option Castellanos hadn't considered. "I need a scalpel," she said quietly. Castellanos gestured to one of his men, who produced a sterile surgical kit from the supply cabinet. Elena's fingers closed around the scalpel handle, feeling its familiar weight, an instrument of precision that could heal or destroy depending on the surgeon's intent. "Smart choice," Castellanos said, settling back into his chair. "Marcus has been asking about you for years, wondering if the legendary Cartel surgeon was still alive." Elena made the first incision, opening Agent Vega's abdomen to assess internal damage. Blood welled up immediately, but not the arterial spray that would indicate irreparable trauma. She could save him. The question was whether she wanted to. "Tell me about the night Webb's unit died," she said, her voice steady as she worked. Castellanos laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Still trying to understand the game, aren't you? Always thinking there's some moral clarity hiding underneath the chaos." Elena's hands moved with practiced efficiency, locating the source of internal bleeding. A nick to the liver, repairable. Fragments from a shattered rib causing tissue damage. Standard trauma surgery, made surreal by the circumstances. 3 months of planning, Castellanos continued, his voice taking on the nostalgic tone of someone recounting a particularly successful business venture. "Marcus fed me their operational timeline, entry points, extraction routes. I had shooters positioned 6 hours before Delta Force even crossed the border." The scalpel trembled in Elena's grip. Webb's teammates, young soldiers following orders, walking into an ambush orchestrated by the very agency meant to support them. She'd spent weeks treating his psychological wounds without understanding their true source. "Webb wasn't supposed to survive," she said. "No one was supposed to survive. Clean sweep, but your boy is tougher than anticipated." Castellanos pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like operational reports. Took 3 bullets and still managed to extract himself. Impressive, really. Elena clamped a bleeding vessel, her movements automatic, while her mind processed implications. And then he spent 5 years hunting for answers. "Hunting for me." Castellanos' expression darkened. "Getting closer each month. Marcus tried to misdirect the investigation, but Webb is persistent." The warehouse lights flickered, casting shifting shadows across the surgical field. Elena had almost forgotten how Castellanos preferred to stage these encounters. Dramatic lighting, isolated locations, the constant reminder that she existed at his pleasure. "The Senate race," she said, understanding blooming like nausea in her stomach. "You're about to become untouchable. Border Security Committee, intelligence oversight, access to operational details across every federal agency." Castellanos leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Do you understand what that means for our network?" Elena did understand. Complete intelligence penetration, the ability to identify threats years before they materialized. American law enforcement turned into an extension of cartel operations, all wrapped in the legitimacy of democratic process. Agent Vega's blood pressure was stabilizing under her hands. She could feel his body responding to treatment, life reasserting itself through proper medical intervention. In 30 minutes, he'd be conscious enough to speak, to confirm everything Castellanos had revealed about the network, the betrayals, the systematic corruption. "What happens to Webb?" she asked. "What do you think happens?" Castellanos' voice carried the patience of a teacher explaining obvious mathematics. "He knows too much, has seen too much. Men like that don't retire quietly." Elena's scars began to burn, phantom pain from wounds that had never properly healed. But for the first time in years, the sensation didn't feel like punishment. It felt like awakening. "And me, after I save your friend? You disappear again. New identity, new location. Maybe somewhere warmer this time. I'm thinking Guatemala has excellent medical infrastructure needs." Castellanos smiled with what might have been genuine warmth. "You've earned retirement, Elena. Permanent retirement." The euphemism hung in the air like surgical smoke. Elena continued working, repairing tissue damage with movements that had saved dozens of lives over the years. But her mind was calculating different equations now. Distance to the exit, number of armed men, Vega's condition if she stopped operating immediately. "Sophia," she said quietly, "your daughter." Castellanos' expression softened into something resembling sympathy. "What about her? Webb promised I could visit her grave. And you can, after we finish here." He checked his watch. Expensive, probably Swiss. Marcus should be stable enough to travel within the hour. Then we'll arrange a final visit before the relocation. Elena's hands stilled over Agent Vega's open abdomen. The man who'd betrayed Webb's unit lay unconscious beneath surgical lights, dependent on her skills for survival. Around them, armed men waited for her to complete the operation that would secure Castellanos' network for another decade. But Webb was still alive, still hunting, still believing that justice meant something more than survival. Elena picked up the scalpel again, its edge catching fluorescent light like a steel prayer. "Actually," she said, "I think we need to discuss new terms." The warehouse fell silent except for the steady beep of Agent Vega's heart monitor. Elena kept the scalpel poised over his exposed abdomen, feeling the weight of 15 years' worth of compromises crystallizing into a single moment of choice. "New terms?" Castellanos' voice carried the indulgent tone of someone humoring a child. "Elena, you seem to misunderstand your position here." "Do I?" She shifted the blade slightly, letting its edge catch the fluorescent light. "Because from where I'm standing, your friend Marcus bleeds out without my skills. And dead men can't provide Senate intelligence." The armed men around the warehouse perimeter tensed, hands drifting toward weapons. But Castellanos held up a restraining gesture, his predator's instincts recognizing something new in Elena's posture, something that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. "You won't let him die," he said with certainty. "It's not who you are." Elena's laugh carried no warmth. "You mean it's not who you needed me to be, the compliant surgeon, the grateful asset, the woman so broken by guilt that she'd trade anything for another day of borrowed peace." She moved the scalpel with surgical precision, making an incision that bypassed the liver repair entirely. Blood welled up, not fatal, but definitely not therapeutic. Agent Vega's vitals fluctuated on the monitor. 15 years, she continued, her voice steady as her hands. 15 years of believing I'd escaped Juarez, that Sophia's death had purchased something resembling freedom. But there was never any escape, was there, Ricardo? Castellanos' composure cracked slightly at her use of his first name, the informal address stripping away layers of constructed authority. "Elena, you're making a mistake." "The mistake was believing your promises." She made another cut, this one deliberately shallow but strategically placed to worsen the internal bleeding. The mistake was thinking survival justified collaboration. Agent Vega's blood pressure began dropping again. Elena watched the numbers fall while calculating exactly how much damage she could inflict before reaching the point of no return. Her medical training had taught her to preserve life, but it had also taught her precisely how life ended. "You killed my daughter," she said, the words carrying 15 years of suppressed rage. "Not the fever, not the infection. You, by keeping me in that compound. By making me watch cartel enforcers torture children while I patched up their handlers. Sophia's death was regrettable. Sophia's death was murder." Elena's voice cut through his rationalization like the scalpel cut through tissue. "And Webb's teammates, and every agent whose cover you burned to protect this network. All of it murder dressed up as business necessity." She could hear movement in the shadows, Castellanos' men repositioning for cleaner shots. But they couldn't risk hitting their boss, and Elena had positioned herself perfectly between the surgical table and Castellanos' chair. "You think Webb is hunting you for justice?" she continued, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the emotional maelstrom in her chest. "He's hunting you because men like you taught him that justice is a luxury only the powerful can afford. That survival requires becoming the monster." Castellanos leaned forward, his mask of paternal concern finally slipping away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "And what do you think you're doing right now, Elena? Isn't this exactly the same choice?" The question hit harder than any physical blow because it carried the weight of truth. Elena felt the familiar spiral of moral compromise beginning, the same logic that had kept her cutting for the cartel, that had convinced her cooperation meant survival. But then she remembered Webb's face when he'd spoken about visiting Sophia's grave. Not the face of a hunter stalking prey, but of a man who understood that some debts could only be paid in full. "No," she said quietly. "This is different." She made the final cut with surgical precision, severing the hepatic artery with a movement so swift and clean that Agent Vega's blood pressure plummeted before the monitors could register the damage. "This is choice." Castellanos lunged forward, but Elena was already moving. The scalpel became a weapon, its blade finding the soft space between his ribs with the same precision she'd once used to save lives. He stumbled backward, hands clutching at the wound, his face registering shock that anyone, least of all his carefully controlled asset, would dare resist. 15 years of scars," Elena said, feeling the ritual markings on her arms burn like brands. 15 years of believing I deserved the cage you built around my life. But Sophia deserved better. And so did those soldiers. She could hear shouts, footsteps, the metallic snap of weapons being raised. But she felt strangely peaceful as she watched Castellanos fall, the man who had reshaped her existence with promises of protection, finally reduced to his essential nature. Just another patient beyond saving. Elena closed her eyes and waited for whatever came next, finally understanding that some freedoms were worth dying to claim. The gunshots never came. Elena opened her eyes to find Webb standing in the warehouse doorway, rifle raised, 3 of Castellanos' men already down. The remaining sicarios had their weapons trained on him, but none were firing, professional killers recognizing the tactical standoff that left everyone dead if anyone pulled a trigger. "Dr. Vasquez," Webb called across the space, his voice carrying the same steady calm she remembered from her clinic. "Step away from the table." Elena looked down at Castellanos, who was trying to apply pressure to the wound between his ribs while blood seeped through his fingers. Agent Vega's monitors showed flatline, the corrupt DEA liaison dead from surgical precision rather than cartel brutality. "How did you find us?" she asked, though she was already moving away from the surgical table, her hands still slick with blood that felt different from all the blood that had come before. "Same way I found you the first time." Webb's eyes never left the armed men around the warehouse perimeter. "I followed the corruption." Castellanos tried to speak, but only managed a wet cough that sprayed crimson across his expensive suit. Elena watched him struggle with the clinical detachment she'd once reserved for cartel enforcers, men whose lives she'd prolonged without ever considering their humanity. "Marcus gave up the network," Webb continued, taking a step into the warehouse. Every asset, every operation. 15 years of intelligence sharing. Turns out dying men value honesty more than loyalty. Elena felt something break loose in her chest, not grief, but the absence of guilt that had weighed on her for so long it had become part of her skeletal structure. The corrupt agent was dead. Castellanos was bleeding out. The network that had shaped her existence for 15 years was finally collapsing. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you walk out of here." Webb's rifle tracked one of the sicarios who'd shifted position. "And you disappear. Real disappearance this time, not another one of his fabrications." Elena looked at Castellanos, whose breathing had become shallow and irregular. She could save him. Medical training died hard, and part of her still calculated treatment protocols automatically. Chest tube to relieve the pneumothorax, IV fluids to maintain blood pressure. Emergency transport to a level 1 trauma center. Instead, she stepped further away from the table. "My daughter's grave," she said. "GPS coordinates are in your truck." Webb's voice softened slightly, along with documentation proving your death in Juarez 15 years ago. Real documentation this time. Castellanos made one final attempt to speak, his eyes finding Elena's face with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been respect. She couldn't tell which, and realized she didn't care. The man who'd convinced her that survival required collaboration was discovering the limits of his own philosophy. "The other clinics," Elena said, thinking of medical facilities across the border region that might house assets like herself. The other doctors he recruited, already being contacted. Webb gestured toward the warehouse exit. "Go, Dr. Vasquez, before his backup arrives." Elena walked toward the doorway, passing close enough to smell cordite and blood and the industrial disinfectant that seemed to follow violence everywhere. As she reached Webb's position, she paused. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "When you first came to my clinic, you could have explained everything." Webb's scarred face showed something that might have been regret. "Would you have believed me, or would you have run?" The honesty of it hit her like surgical light, harsh but necessary. She would have run. Would have disappeared into whatever escape route Castellanos had prepared, carrying the network's secrets to another fabricated life in another fabricated sanctuary. The Senate race? Marcus withdrew his candidacy an hour ago. Medical emergency. Webb's smile held no warmth. Amazing how quickly political careers end when the right people start asking the right questions. Elena stepped into the Mexican night, feeling desert air on her face for the first time in years without the weight of invisible surveillance. Behind her, she could hear Webb coordinating with what sounded like federal agents, voices identifying themselves with alphabet soup acronyms that suggested the cavalry had finally arrived. Her truck sat in the gravel parking area exactly where she'd left it, but now there was a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Inside, she found coordinates for a cemetery in El Paso, along with documents establishing her legal death in a Juarez warehouse 15 years earlier. The kind of bureaucratic resurrection that only happened when someone very powerful wanted someone very dangerous to disappear completely. Elena started the engine and drove toward the border, toward her daughter's grave, toward whatever came after 15 years of borrowed time finally ran out. In her rearview mirror, she watched the warehouse lights fade until they became just another point of illumination in a landscape that had finally stopped hunting her. The scars on her arms would always remain, but for the first time since Sophia's death, they felt like evidence rather than ownership, proof that some debts, once paid in full, could finally stop collecting interest.